Sure, you've all heard of culture shock. Well, we're actually going to try and work our way through it a little bit, maybe give you some tools to help you from culture shock to acculturation and adaptation, going through the process of assimilating culture. Hopefully, we'll have some smiley faces rather than some frown faces as a result of your cross-cultural experiences and learning about different identity and multiculturalism and globalization. So we think of acculturation or assimilation, adaptation to a new culture. A nice mnemonic device to think through are the ABCs. So the affective, which is stress and coping approach, behavioral, socio-cultural adaptation, we'll look at some of that in more detail, and the cognitive, the social identification theory. How, as we think of a cultural learning framework, first will be based in social experimental psychology, fairly new field, and then we'll look at how the intercultural difficulties can be lessened as we acquire more culturally appropriate skills within an adapted culture and the multicultural society in which we find ourselves in. We'll see that that actually will lead to better behavioral outcomes for both us as the outsider and for the person's host culture, which we're going to be working in. We'll see how that can really be a big benefit by having this understanding as we move through. Under this area of the conceptual frameworks, we'll look at culture learning and the stress and coping mechanism for the affective area. And so here I created a little bit of a graphic to kind of distill this a little bit for our understanding in a cross-cultural situation for adaptation. In the socio-cultural area, learning the social skills generally, and then in a domain-specific area for a specific job, if you're an educator or if you're working for a company in HR or doing some training for a company, that would be in that socio-cultural area, your job performance. Generally in your social skills and how you would interact with that group, and then psychological would be more of your personal well-being, generally speaking, and then your domain-specific job satisfaction. So those things will affect that and your understanding. This graphic and under cultural learning through a context, the cultural context here at the top and then the organizational context at the bottom, you see the individual characteristics that stand out. These will be different for each person depending on their experiences and what cultural grid they're coming from. Plus the learning opportunities they have within another culture. Also what training they have, any kind of overseas experience or intercultural experience, living within a multicultural society, what has influenced them. And over time, they will be able to blend these two into some specific cultural skills and behaviors to help them assimilate and adapt into that new culture. Here's a compiled list of some predictors of socio-cultural adaptation. Obviously, understanding the culture specifically for the group that you're working with, that local group, language proficiency, whatever language the host culture speaks, if it's the same as yours or different, that's going to obviously affect the amount of adaptation you can have and will feel. Your intercultural contact, are you distant from them? Do you go home to another place away from maybe a compound or something like that where you're not having that contact with the people on a daily basis, only in the work environment or the school environment? Intercultural training, what's your background there? Cultural distance, and we'll look at that in the next slides. Length of residence in the new culture. If you're fairly new, you've been there for 5 or 10 years, that's going to be a big difference. Get through that first year especially will definitely be a predictor. Now moving into the behavioral section of the ABCs of acculturation. We have the affective we just looked at, and now the behavioral into socio-cultural adaptation. This is a nice graphic by Mascoret and Ward, and looking at our behavioral relationships, intercultural language communication, and how that affects our adaptation into the socio-cultural realm and sphere. It has all these areas have some really good predictors and some good influences on helping us to assimilate and to adapt behaviorally. I think these next items here on globalization identity, some things that will really help adapt in the behavioral areas, interpersonal skills for interacting with hosts. If you're introvert here, you're going to be an introvert in a different culture. If you're an extrovert here, you're going to extrovert in a different culture. Knowing those things, you'll take those with you, your temperament, your personality, and how you interact here. Some people, for whatever reason, think that they'll act differently in a different culture based on how that culture, some reasons they think that they'll become like this superhero or be able to shed their past in a sense, but in reality we take it with us. And so understanding those things that you will take with you, how you need to maybe adjust, tone down, or to bring up a little bit some personality skills. So understanding the host culture values is key. And then also, what are the work performance standards? Are you going to be offensive if you're trying to browbeat everybody after lunch and say, hey, we got back here a half hour, where they may be typically used to taking an hour and a half to 2 hour lunch with a siesta? So again, knowing that host culture will be key. And now here's the graphic with the cultural distance. The predictors here by Ward and Kennedy that put this together on a scale of 12 here of how different it would be for us to work in different cultures, whether you're from Japan or New Zealand, Malaysians working in New Zealand, or Americans working in Singapore, and some of the cultural distances that we have with each other. You see, Britons and Americans pretty close. Malaysians and Chinese, I mentioned earlier, pretty close. Japan and Chinese has quite a big difference, and Japan and Malaysian, Japanese and Malaysians in New Zealand a little bit closer there. Seeing that kind of makes sense a little bit of trying to understand assimilation issues that we may have in adaptation depending on what cultural distance we have from the culture that we're going into. Here we'll delve in a little bit deeper on the effective area of stress and coping that we talked about earlier on that first slide when we introduced the ABCs of acculturation, assimilation, adaptation, and look at the different level factors that affect this: our age, gender, personality, social support, discrimination. All these things will be a factor in how we cope with stress within a cultural context, and then seeing those adaptive outcomes at the end. Here are some ideas about social support and getting that help. Expatriates can use local and overseas sources for social support. Evaluated as overseas sources, evaluated as closer, stronger, and more familiar. Local sources are used most often for practical informational support. And you can read the last one there of the different emotional support and helping with that psychological adaptation as you go through the change process of assimilating and adapting into a new culture. Another thing to think about in the social readjustment rating scale is come up with is some of the things that are going to affect your cross-cultural adaptation too, or is obviously the transition overseas, but also life changes. What kind of work, what kind of new social activities are you involved in? Where are your family members? Do you have younger kids, older kids? Are they left back in your home country versus gone with you? What sort of things have happened there? What sort of friendships and leaving friends behind and gaining new friends? Living conditions obviously is going to be a huge deal along with your residence. We're moving overseas and having different ways of getting mail and doing exchange for currencies, and everything is just so much different. Thinking through these things and helping you to rate these on a scale of the things that are going to affect you more. These are just a few of the items, but obviously there's lots more. For some people, those would be different than others. Some things would be more intense and some things maybe, don't worry so much about that. Maybe you're a sports fan, you want to watch American football and you can't see it all the time when you normally like you would in the States. Vice versa, if you really like soccer and football from the general sense that the rest of the world sees it, or cricket or rugby. Shopping's another one, big one for women, and the ability to be able to go out on their own versus needing to go with a group or with a male figure to protect them is a line of protection. All those things will be predictors and help us to understand what's it going to take for us to adjust and how to adjust to those changes. This is really key to think through as well. Appraisal, expectations, adaptation. What do we do when our expectations aren't met? And they will not be met in a different culture. So you're going to feel that frustration. So what happens next? How are you going to deal with that? Is it going to go into a culture stress that kind of wears on you for a while, and then all of a sudden an event happens and it becomes culture shock that we hear of so much, and you get that real intense, overwhelming feeling that you want to get out of there and go back to your home country. And obviously, you probably felt this as well in the appraisal, expectation, adaptation, even in your own country. The expectations, the experiences, the greater those discrepancies are. Maybe somebody's talked up a movie or a TV show or a book, and you read it or you went to it, and it wasn't everything that you thought it was going to be. It was okay, but it didn't live up. Well, in a different culture, that's going to affect you as well with your expectations, will affect you psychologically. And obviously, you probably felt this as well in the appraisal, expectation, adaptation, even in your own country. The expectations, the experiences, the greater those discrepancies are. Maybe somebody's talked up a movie or a TV show or a book, and you read it or you went to it, and it wasn't everything that you thought it was going to be. It was okay, but it didn't live up. Well, in a different culture, that's going to affect you as well with your expectations, will affect you psychologically.